What would you do if you were handed an order that you knew would send hundreds of your men to their deaths, but refusing it might cost the war? On March 6, 1944, Brigadier General Robert Travis stood in a freezing briefing room in eastern England, staring at reconnaissance photographs that made his blood run cold. Berlin. The heart of Nazi Germany. 500 miles deep into enemy territory, protected by thousands of anti-aircraft guns and the most experienced fighter pilots the Luftwaffe had left. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mission seemed like suicide. Weather forecasters predicted heavy cloud cover that would make bombing nearly impossible. Intelligence reports showed unprecedented German fighter strength along the route. Every calculation suggested catastrophic losses. Yet the order came directly from the top, a directive so urgent that it bypassed normal planning protocols. Travis had 12 hours to prepare his men for what would become the most controversial bombing raid of the entire war. A raid that would claim 53 heavy bombers and their crews before sunset. A raid that his own intelligence officer begged him to cancel. A raid that would either break the back of German war production or shatter the morale of the entire 8th Air Force. This is the story of a commander who made an impossible choice, a decision so divisive that it would haunt military strategists for generations, yet ultimately proved to be one of the turning points that sealed Nazi Germany's fate. Robert James Travis was never supposed to become a general. Born in 1904 to a family of Georgia schoolteachers, he grew up in an era when aviation itself was still a novelty, when the Wright brothers' first flight was recent memory rather than ancient history. While other boys dreamed of becoming doctors or lawyers, young Robert was obsessed with the fragile biplanes that occasionally buzzed over his small town, their fabric wings trembling in the wind. His parents wanted him to follow them into education, to take over the local schoolhouse where his father had taught mathematics for 30 years. Instead, at 17, Robert forged his father's signature on enlistment papers and joined the Army Air Service, lying about his age to pursue the only dream that had ever mattered to him. Flying wasn't just a career for Travis. It was a calling that consumed every waking moment. By 1925, he had earned his wings and was flying mail routes across the treacherous Allegheny Mountains, navigating by landmarks and instinct in an age before radio beacons or reliable instruments. Those early years shaped everything about his command philosophy. He learned that survival in the air required split-second decisions based on incomplete information, that hesitation killed pilots faster than enemy fire, and that the difference between courage and recklessness was often measured in fractions of a degree. When World War II erupted in Europe, Travis was a seasoned pilot with over 5,000 flight hours, but he had never commanded men in combat. His superiors recognized something in the quiet Georgian that transcended technical skill. Perhaps it was his uncanny ability to assess risk with mathematical precision, or maybe it was the way younger pilots gravitated toward him, seeking wisdom from a man who had survived situations that had killed dozens of their predecessors. By early 1944, Travis found himself commanding the 482nd Bombardment Group, a unit tasked with some of the most dangerous missions in the European theater. His men called him the professor behind his back, not mockingly, but with genuine respect for a commander who insisted on understanding every detail of every mission, who could calculate fuel consumption and wind drift in his head faster than others could with slide rules, and who never sent his crews anywhere he wouldn't fly himself. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany had been raging for over a year by the time Travis received the Berlin Order. American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators had been pounding German industrial targets relentlessly, but at terrible cost. The Luftwaffe, though weakened from its earlier strength, still possessed enough fighters and anti-aircraft artillery to turn the skies over Germany into a killing field. Every mission was a calculated gamble. Commanders weighed the potential damage to German war production against the inevitable loss of aircraft and crews. Some targets were worth the sacrifice. Others became cautionary tales of missions that achieved nothing while decimating entire bomb groups. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A typical deep penetration raid into Germany could expect to lose 10% of its aircraft. That meant out of every 100 bombers that took off, 10 would never return, representing 90 men killed or captured. For the crews, this created an impossible psychological burden. Each man knew that statistically, completing the required 25 missions was unlikely. The odds improved slightly with each successful sortie, but they never approached certainty. Many pilots developed elaborate rituals before missions, lucky charms and superstitions that gave them an illusion of control over forces that were essentially random. Travis understood this psychology better than most commanders. He had flown enough missions himself to know the peculiar terror of waiting for takeoff, the way time seemed to dilate during the approach to the target, and the strange mixture of relief and guilt that came from surviving when others didn't. This understanding made him cautious, perhaps too cautious in the eyes of some superior officers who valued aggressive action over careful planning. By March 1944, the Allied High Command was desperately seeking ways to accelerate Germany's collapse. The planned invasion of Normandy was only months away, and success depended on crippling German industrial capacity before Allied troops hit the beaches. Berlin represented the ultimate prize, housing critical ball-bearing factories, aircraft production facilities, and rail marshalling yards that supplied the entire Eastern Front. Previous raids on Berlin had been conducted primarily at night by the British Royal Air Force, whose strategy involved area bombing of urban districts. The Americans preferred precision daylight bombing of specific industrial targets, believing it would be more effective at disrupting German war production. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But daylight raids required fighters' escorts, and Berlin was beyond the range of most Allied fighters. The P-51 Mustang, with its extended-range tanks, had only recently begun operations, and there weren't enough of them to adequately protect a major Berlin raid. This created a strategic dilemma that had paralyzed planning for months. How could American bombers reach Berlin in daylight without prohibitive losses? The answer came not from tactical innovation but from strategic desperation. Intelligence reports in late February 1944 revealed that German fighter production was surging despite months of bombing. New factories hidden in forests and mountains were churning out aircraft faster than Allied raids could destroy them. If this continued, the Luftwaffe might regain air superiority over France just as the invasion began, turning the beaches of Normandy into a slaughter. Something had to be done immediately, even if it meant accepting losses that would normally be considered unacceptable. The order that reached Travis on the evening of March 5 was unlike anything he had seen before. It came through encrypted channels directly from 8th Air Force headquarters, bypassing the normal chain of coordination and review. The mission parameters were stark and uncompromising. Maximum effort. Every available bomber. Target, Berlin. Date, tomorrow. Travis read the order 3 times, certain there had been some mistake. The weather forecast showed solid cloud cover over Germany, making accurate bombing nearly impossible. Fighter escort would be limited to the absolute range limits of the P-51s, leaving the bombers vulnerable for long stretches of the mission. Intelligence estimated that the Luftwaffe could put up over 400 fighters to defend Berlin. He called his intelligence officer, Major Samuel Kowalski, a former mathematics professor from Chicago who had a genius for calculating mission probabilities. Kowalski arrived within minutes, still buttoning his uniform jacket. Travis handed him the order without comment and watched the color drain from the younger man's face. Kowalski spread maps across the briefing table and began calculating. Fuel requirements. Flight times. Expected fighter opposition. Probable weather conditions. His pencil scratched across paper for 20 minutes while Travis waited in silence. Finally, Kowalski looked up, and Travis saw something he had never seen before in the professor's eyes. Fear. The numbers were devastating. Kowalski estimated losses at between 15 and 20%, possibly higher if weather forced the bombers to make multiple passes over the target. That meant out of the 300 bombers Travis could muster, somewhere between 45 and 60 would never come home. 400 to 500 men would die or spend the rest of the war in German prisoner camps. Travis asked the question that had been burning in his mind since reading the order. Was there any scenario where the mission achieved its objectives while reducing casualties to acceptable levels? Kowalski studied his calculations again, running different scenarios, adjusting variables. Each iteration produced the same grim conclusion. There was no safe way to bomb Berlin in daylight with current resources. The only way to reduce losses would be to cancel the mission entirely or wait for better weather and stronger fighter escort, which might take weeks. But the order was explicit. Maximum effort. Tomorrow. No alternatives mentioned. No discretion authorized. Travis had received orders he disagreed with before, but he had always been able to voice objections through proper channels, to argue for modifications based on tactical realities. This order felt different. Its urgency and unconventional routing suggested that someone very high in the command structure had decided this mission was worth any cost. Refusing would be insubordination. Delaying would be disobedience. But executing it meant knowingly sending dozens of his men to die in a mission that had marginal chances of success. Travis dismissed Kowalski and sat alone in the briefing room, staring at the maps spread before him. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the air base at night, mechanics working on engines, trucks moving supplies, the distant hum of generators. In a few hours, he would have to face his crews and explain why they were being sent on a mission that violated every principle of tactical aviation he had spent 20 years learning. The door opened, and his operations officer, Colonel William Harrison, entered without knocking. Harrison was a veteran of the early raids, a hard-bitten pilot from Texas who had survived more missions than anyone else in the group. He had seen the encrypted order and knew what Travis was wrestling with. Harrison pulled up a chair and spoke in his distinctive drawl. He reminded Travis that they were not fighting a normal war against a normal enemy. The Germans had industrialized genocide, were developing rockets and jet aircraft that could change the strategic balance, and would fight to the last bullet unless broken completely. Sometimes, Harrison argued, winning required accepting costs that seemed unbearable. Travis listened but remained unconvinced. He argued that throwing away crews on poorly planned missions didn't win wars, it just created more widows and orphans while accomplishing nothing. If the mission had a reasonable chance of success, he would fly it himself without hesitation. But sending men into a meat grinder based on optimistic assumptions and desperate hope was not leadership, it was murder. Harrison leaned back and asked the question that cut to the heart of the dilemma. If Travis refused or delayed the mission, and German fighter production continued unchecked, how many Allied soldiers would die on the beaches of Normandy? How many bombers would be shot down in subsequent months by fighters that could have been destroyed in their factories today? The moral calculus was impossible. Certain deaths now versus probable deaths later. Known casualties versus statistical projections. The lives of men Travis knew personally versus the lives of soldiers he would never meet. There was no right answer, only different shades of terrible. Travis stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness where his bombers sat waiting. 300 aircraft. 3,000 men. Some were veterans who had survived dozens of missions through skill and luck. Others were on their first or second sortie, still learning how to function in combat. All of them trusted him to use their lives wisely, to risk them only when the objective justified the sacrifice. He thought about his own father, the schoolteacher who had wanted his son to have a safe, predictable life. What would that gentleman think of his son now, preparing to send hundreds of young men into almost certain death? Would he understand the necessity, or would he see only the waste? Travis turned from the window and made his decision. He would fly the mission as ordered, but he would do everything in his power to reduce the cost. He would personally lead the formation, using his experience to find the best routes and tactics. He would brief the crews with brutal honesty about what they faced, giving them no false hope but also no excuse for panic. And he would make sure that every bomber that could be made airworthy would fly, because spreading the defensive firepower across more aircraft might marginally improve everyone's chances. Harrison nodded slowly, recognizing the resolve in Travis's face. He asked one more question. What should he tell the crews? Travis's answer was simple. Tell them the truth. Tell them this mission matters more than any we have flown. Tell them that losses will be heavy but that their sacrifice might save thousands of lives in the months ahead. And tell them that anyone who wants to transfer out before briefing will face no disciplinary action. It was an unprecedented offer. Pilots could refuse combat missions only by admitting cowardice, effectively ending their military careers in disgrace. Travis was offering them an honorable exit, or recognition that this mission exceeded normal expectations of duty. Harrison looked shocked but said nothing. He simply saluted and left to begin preparations. Travis spent the rest of the night reviewing intelligence reports, weather forecasts, and aircraft maintenance logs. He calculated and recalculated fuel loads, trying to find any margin that might extend fighter escort or provide extra speed for evasion. He studied recent mission reports, looking for tactical lessons that might reduce vulnerability. And he wrote letters to the families of men he expected would not return, letters he would mail only if the worst predictions came true. As dawn approached on March 6, 1944, Travis finally allowed himself to acknowledge the fear that had been gnawing at him since reading the order. This mission might not just fail. It might break the 8th Air Force's will to continue daylight bombing. If losses exceeded 20%, if most of those beautiful bombers never returned, the psychological impact could be devastating. Crews might refuse to fly. Commanders might revolt against further strategic bombing. The entire air campaign could collapse. But there was also another possibility, one that Travis almost didn't dare imagine. What if the mission succeeded beyond expectations? What if the bombers got through, destroyed their targets, and returned with manageable losses? The boost to morale could be incalculable, proving that even Berlin was vulnerable to American air power. It might convince the Germans that nowhere was safe, that their industrial heartland could be destroyed at will. The mission was a knife edge, balanced between catastrophic failure and historic victory. And Travis held the lives of 3,000 men in his hands as he prepared to find out which way it would fall. At 0500 hours, the briefing room filled with aircrews who had been roused from sleep and told to report immediately. The usual banter and nervous jokes were absent. Something about the urgency of the wake-up call, the grim faces of the operations staff, told them this was different. When Travis entered the room, the silence became absolute. He walked to the front and pulled back the curtain covering the mission map. The collective intake of breath was audible. A red ribbon stretched from their base in England across the North Sea, deep into Germany, terminating at a single word that made every man's stomach drop. Berlin. 500 miles into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. Travis didn't soften the blow. He explained that intelligence indicated critical ball bearing and aircraft component factories in Berlin were operating at full capacity, supplying the German war machine with materials that could prolong the conflict for months or years. The targets had to be destroyed now, before the planned invasion made every day of continued German resistance exponentially more costly in Allied lives. He showed them the weather forecast, acknowledging that cloud cover would make precision bombing difficult. He showed them the fighter escort plan, admitting that P-51s could only accompany them partway before fuel limitations forced them to turn back. He showed them the intelligence estimates of Luftwaffe strength, not minimizing the danger they would face. Then he told them about his offer. Any man who felt unable to fly this mission could step out now with no questions asked. No disciplinary action, no mark on their record. It was an acknowledgement that this mission exceeded normal operational parameters, that it demanded something extra from every participant. Nobody moved. 300 pilots, navigators, bombardiers, engineers, radio operators, and gunners sat frozen in their seats. Some were undoubtedly terrified and wanted desperately to take the offer, but peer pressure and pride kept them glued to their chairs. Others genuinely believed in the mission, trusted Travis to bring them through, or simply accepted that this was what they had trained for. Travis felt a wave of emotion he quickly suppressed. These boys, most barely old enough to vote, were about to fly into hell because he had ordered it. Some wouldn't see tomorrow. That knowledge sat like lead in his chest, but he couldn't let them see his doubt. A commander who betrayed uncertainty could break morale faster than enemy fire. He concluded the briefing with tactical instructions. tight formations to maximize defensive firepower. Strict radio discipline to prevent German controllers from tracking their progress. Predesignated rally points if formations became scattered. Emergency procedures if forced to bail out over enemy territory. Every detail designed to give them the best possible chance of survival. As crews filed out to their aircraft, Travis pulled aside his most experienced squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison. Morrison had flown 32 missions, far beyond the required 25, volunteering to stay on because he believed his skills could help younger crews survive. Travis asked Morrison to take the lead bomber position, the most dangerous spot in the formation and traditionally reserved for the group commander. Morrison understood immediately what Travis was doing. By flying lead himself, Travis would be the first into enemy fire, demonstrating that he wouldn't ask his men to face dangers he avoided. But Morrison argued that the group needed Travis alive more than it needed symbolic gestures. If Travis went down over Berlin, who would lead future missions? Who would fight for these crews when higher headquarters demanded impossible operations? Travis appreciated the logic but rejected it. He explained that if this mission failed catastrophically, there might not be future missions, at least not with him in command. Either way, his leadership would be judged by what happened today. He needed to be there, needed to see with his own eyes what he was asking of his men, needed to share the risk he had imposed on them. Morrison recognized the futility of arguing further. He simply asked Travis to at least fly in the second position, allowing Morrison to take the most exposed lead spot. It was a compromise that satisfied honor without being completely reckless. Travis agreed, and the two men shook hands with the gravity of soldiers who knew they might not both survive the day. By 0700 hours, 300 bombers were lined up on runways across eastern England, their engines coughing to life in the cold morning air. The sound was thunderous, a mechanical symphony that could be heard for miles. Ground crews performed final checks, loading bombs and ammunition, topping off fuel tanks, making last-minute adjustments to engines and instruments. In the cockpit of his B-17, Travis ran through pre-flight checks with mechanical precision, his hands moving over switches and gauges with the muscle memory of thousands of hours. His co-pilot, a young lieutenant named David Chen from California, watched nervously. This was Chen's 8th mission, enough to understand the dangers but not enough to develop the fatalistic calm of true veterans. Travis glanced at Chen and saw his own younger self reflected back, the eager pilot who thought skill and courage could overcome any obstacle. 20 years of flying had taught Travis that survival in combat was mostly luck, with skill providing only marginal improvements to terrible odds. But he couldn't tell Chen that. The boy needed to believe he had some control over his fate. The tower gave clearance, and one by one, the heavy bombers began their takeoff rolls. Each aircraft was loaded beyond normal capacity with fuel and bombs, requiring every inch of runway to become airborne. Travis watched Morrison's bomber lift off smoothly, then advanced his throttles and felt his own aircraft begin its lumbering acceleration. The runway blurred beneath them as airspeed built. At the critical moment, Travis pulled back on the yoke and felt the bomber reluctantly leave the ground, clawing for altitude with engines straining against the weight. Beside him, Chen called out altitudes and speeds while Travis focused on joining the formation that was assembling overhead. It took nearly an hour for all 300 bombers to form up into their assigned groups and wings. They circled over England in a vast aerial armada, the morning sun glinting off aluminum fuselages and perspex windows. From the ground, it must have looked magnificent, a demonstration of American industrial might. From inside the bombers, it felt more like a funeral procession. At 0830, the formation turned east and headed toward the North Sea. This was the point of no return. Once they crossed the English coast, they were committed to the mission. Travis keyed his radio and transmitted the code word that meant all groups were to proceed to target. Acknowledge lights blinked from other bombers as each commander confirmed receipt of the order. The flight across the North Sea was tense but uneventful. Crews tested their guns, firing short bursts into the ocean to ensure the weapons hadn't frozen. Navigators took celestial shots to confirm their position. Pilots adjusted formations to maintain tight spacing that would maximize their combined defensive firepower when the inevitable fighter attacks began. P-51 Mustangs appeared at the Dutch coast, sleek silver fighters that took up escort positions around the bomber stream. Their presence was reassuring but temporary. Everyone knew the fighters had limited range and would have to turn back long before the bombers reached Berlin. The real test would come when they were alone over Germany. The German coast appeared as a dark line on the horizon. Travis felt his pulse quicken despite years of experience. This was always the worst moment, crossing from relative safety into hostile airspace where thousands of anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of fighters waited to kill them. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to maintain the calm demeanor his crew needed to see. Flak began as they crossed the coast, black puffs of smoke appearing around the formation as German gunners found their range. The explosions were close enough that Travis could feel the concussion through the bomber's airframe. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like hail, and he heard Chen gasp as a particularly close burst rocked the aircraft. Travis kept his voice steady on the intercom, reminding the crew to stay focused on their jobs. The waist gunners reported minor damage but nothing critical. They pressed on, flying deeper into Germany while flak batteries tracked their progress with deadly accuracy. Travis saw one bomber take a direct hit, its left wing shearing off in a shower of aluminum and fire. The aircraft spun downward, too fast for anyone to bail out. 10 men gone in an instant. He forced himself to look away and concentrate on holding formation. Dwelling on casualties would paralyze him, and his crew needed him alert. The navigator called out checkpoints, confirming they were on course for Berlin. Ahead, Travis could see the cloud layer that weather forecasters had predicted, a solid blanket of gray that would make their bombing run far more difficult. At 15,000 feet, they entered the clouds and visibility dropped to zero. This was incredibly dangerous. Maintaining formation in clouds required constant vigilance to avoid mid-air collisions. Travis focused on Morrison's bomber barely visible ahead, using it as a reference point while his co-pilot monitored instruments to prevent spatial disorientation. The P-51 escorts radioed that they were approaching maximum range and had to turn back. Their commander wished the bombers good luck with genuine emotion in his voice. Everyone understood what that departure meant. From here on, the bombers were on their own against whatever the Luftwaffe could throw at them. The first German fighters appeared 10 minutes later, diving out of the cloud layer with cannons firing. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, painted in splinter camouflage, attacking with the desperation of men defending their homeland. The bomber formation erupted with defensive fire as dozens of 50-caliber machine guns engaged the attackers. Travis heard his gunners calling out targets on the intercom, their voices tight with adrenaline. Tracers crisscrossed the sky in deadly patterns. A German fighter exploded so close that flaming debris peppered their right wing. Another bomber in their group took hits to both engines and dropped out of formation, losing altitude as its crew fought to keep it airborne long enough to reach neutral territory. The attacks came in waves, relentless and coordinated. German fighter controllers were directing their aircraft with precision, concentrating attacks on specific parts of the formation to break it apart. Travis saw Morrison's bomber take multiple hits but continue flying, trailing smoke from an engine. He radioed to check if Morrison was okay and received a terse affirmative. For 40 minutes, the battle raged across the sky. Bombers and fighters fell in roughly equal numbers, spinning earthward wrapped in flames or breaking apart under the stress of violent maneuvers. The air was thick with smoke, spent shell casings, and the smell of cordite. Travis's crew fought like demons, their guns glowing red from sustained firing. Then, as suddenly as it began, the fighter attack stopped. German aircraft broke off and disappeared into the clouds, leaving the bomber formation battered but intact. Travis didn't celebrate. He knew the Germans were probably just reforming for another attack, or perhaps they had expended their ammunition and fuel. Either way, the respite was temporary. Berlin appeared ahead, partially visible through breaks in the cloud cover. Even from 20,000 feet, Travis could see the sprawl of the German capital, its distinctive geography of rivers and rail yards. Flak increased exponentially as they approached, the Germans throwing up a wall of exploding steel that seemed impossible to penetrate. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, steady despite the chaos. He was beginning his bombing run, leading the formation toward the primary target. Travis followed, holding position while flak burst all around them. The bombardier called out instructions, making minute adjustments to ensure accuracy despite the clouds and smoke. The bomb bay doors opened with a mechanical whine, and Travis felt the aircraft lift slightly as thousands of pounds of bombs fell away. He watched them tumble downward, following Morrison's bombs toward the factories below. Explosions blossomed among the industrial complexes, orange and red flowers of destruction that represented the mission's purpose. But the cost was staggering. As Travis turned away from the target and began the long flight home, he counted the bombers still in formation. 48 were missing from the 300 that had started the mission. 48 aircraft, representing over 400 men, shot down over Germany in less than 3 hours of combat. The flight back was a nightmare of damaged aircraft struggling to maintain altitude, wounded crew members being treated with inadequate medical supplies, and fuel gauges dropping toward empty as engines consumed more than planned, fighting headwinds. Travis radioed constantly, encouraging struggling crews, coordinating with those low on fuel to identify emergency landing fields. 3 more bombers went down over the North Sea, so close to safety but unable to make it. Travis watched helplessly as they ditched in the frigid water, knowing that survival time was measured in minutes in those temperatures. Air-sea rescue would be scrambled, but the odds of reaching them in time were poor. Finally, mercifully, the English coast appeared. Damaged bombers began breaking formation, heading for the nearest airfields where they could land before systems failed completely. Travis stayed with the main formation until everyone who could make it home was safely on approach, then finally brought his own battered aircraft in for landing. The bomber touched down hard, its hydraulics partially damaged, brakes barely functioning. Travis fought the controls as they careered down the runway, finally bringing the aircraft to a stop just short of the overrun. He shut down the engines and sat in silence for a moment, overwhelmed by emotions he had suppressed during the mission. Chin was crying quietly, tears streaming down his young face. The waist gunners were helping each other out of the aircraft, their faces blackened by powder smoke, their hands shaking from adrenaline crash. Travis climbed down from the cockpit and found Morrison waiting, his uniform torn and bloodstained from a piece of shrapnel that had grazed his shoulder. The two commanders embraced briefly, then walked together toward the operations building where the grim task of counting losses would begin. Ground crews were already tallying returning aircraft, their faces growing more somber as the numbers fell short of the morning's total. Final count came in at operations. 247 bombers returned. 53 were missing, presumed lost over Germany or the North Sea. The losses exceeded even Kowalski's pessimistic predictions. Over 500 men were dead, missing, or captured in a single day's operation. Travis felt physically ill as he reviewed the casualty lists. Names he recognized, crews he had trained personally, young men he had shared coffee with just that morning. All gone. And for what? Initial reconnaissance suggested the bombing had caused significant damage to the Berlin factories, but whether that damage justified the losses wouldn't be known for weeks. His operations officer approached with a message from 8th Air Force headquarters. They wanted a preliminary assessment immediately. Travis sat down and began writing, his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and emotion. He detailed the mission profile, the opposition encountered, the losses sustained, and the observed bomb damage. Then he added a personal note that would become controversial. He wrote that while the mission had achieved its tactical objectives, the cost in men and machines was at the absolute limit of sustainability. Another mission with similar losses would break the force's ability to continue operations. He recommended that future deep penetration raids be delayed until adequate long-range fighter escort could be guaranteed and weather conditions were optimal. It was as close as Travis could come to criticizing the order that had sent him to Berlin. He knew his superiors might view it as insubordination, as a commander making excuses for unacceptable losses. But he owed it to the men he had lost to speak truth to power, to ensure their sacrifice wasn't repeated unnecessarily. The response came within hours, and it shocked everyone. Rather than reprimanding Travis for questioning orders, headquarters commended his leadership and announced that his recommendations would be incorporated into future planning. Moreover, preliminary intelligence assessments suggested the Berlin raid had destroyed nearly 40% of German ball-bearing production capacity, a blow that would significantly impact aircraft and vehicle manufacturing for months. The mission, as costly as it had been, was being declared a strategic success. Travis felt no satisfaction in this validation. 53 bombers and their crews were still gone, 53 holes in the formation that would never be filled by the same men who had occupied them that morning. Success measured in such blood seemed hollow. Over the following weeks, the full impact of the Berlin raid became clear. German fighter production dropped sharply as factories struggled to obtain critical components. The Luftwaffe's ability to contest Allied air superiority diminished steadily. When the Normandy invasion finally came 3 months later, Allied bombers and fighters dominated the skies over France, providing crucial support to troops on the ground. Military historians would later argue that the March 6 Berlin raid, despite its terrible cost, represented a turning point in the strategic bombing campaign. It proved that American bombers could reach and damage targets anywhere in Germany, forcing the Luftwaffe to disperse its fighters and dilute their effectiveness. The psychological impact on German morale was equally significant, demonstrating that even the capital was vulnerable. But for Travis and the survivors of that mission, the strategic analysis meant little. They remembered the friends who never came home, the empty bunks in the barracks, the letters they had to write to families explaining how their sons and husbands had died. The mission was successful, yes, but at a price that haunted everyone who participated. Travis himself would fly 17 more combat missions before the war ended, but none affected him as deeply as Berlin. He carried the weight of that decision for the rest of his life, second-guessing whether he could have done something differently, whether those 53 bombers might have been saved with better tactics or timing. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Travis stood among the celebrating crowds but felt oddly detached. Victory had come, as predicted, but the path to that victory was paved with the bodies of men like those lost over Berlin. He understood intellectually that their sacrifice had been necessary, that wars cannot be won without casualties, but emotionally he could never quite reconcile himself to the mathematics of acceptable losses. In the years that followed, Travis would rise to even higher command, eventually retiring as a major general. But he never spoke publicly about the Berlin raid, deflecting questions by noting that many others had shown far greater courage under far worse circumstances. Those who knew him well understood that his silence came not from modesty but from a wound that never fully healed. The lesson of the Berlin raid transcended military strategy. It illustrated the terrible burden of command, the weight of decisions that send others to die while the decision-maker survives. Travis had made the choice that circumstances demanded, had executed his orders as effectively as possible, and had achieved the mission objectives. By every measurable standard, he had succeeded. Yet success felt indistinguishable from failure when counted in the lives of men he had known and valued. This paradox, the collision between strategic necessity and human cost, defines the moral complexity of warfare itself. There are no clean choices when every option involves sacrifice, no purely right answers when all paths lead through suffering. Travis understood this better than most, and that understanding shaped everything he did for the rest of his career. He insisted on knowing the names of every person under his command, on attending memorial services for those killed in action, on personally writing condolence letters rather than allowing staff officers to use form templates. These small acts couldn't bring back the dead or ease the pain of their families, but they represented Travis's attempt to honor the human dimension of strategic decisions. The men who served under Travis in subsequent assignments recognized something different about him compared to other commanders. He never wasted lives on missions of marginal value, never allowed ego or ambition to influence tactical decisions, and never forgot that every casualty represented a unique individual with family, dreams, and potential. This approach sometimes frustrated aggressive subordinates who wanted to chase glory regardless of cost, but it earned Travis fierce loyalty from those who understood the wisdom behind his caution. Years later, when teaching at the Air War College, Travis would use the Berlin raid as a case study in command decision-making under uncertainty. He presented students with the same information he had possessed that March evening in 1944 and asked what they would have done. The responses varied widely, from refusing the order and accepting court-martial to enthusiastically embracing the mission as an opportunity for distinction. Travis never told students what the correct answer was because he believed there wasn't one. The Berlin raid existed in moral and strategic ambiguity, a space where reasonable people could reach different conclusions based on how they weighted competing values. What mattered wasn't the choice itself but the reasoning behind it and the willingness to accept responsibility for consequences. This acknowledgement of complexity, of refusing easy answers to hard questions, became Travis's lasting contribution to military education. He taught generations of officers that leadership meant wrestling with impossible dilemmas, making decisions based on incomplete information, and living with outcomes that would haunt them forever. He taught them that courage wasn't just facing enemy fire but confronting the weight of command when every choice carried terrible costs. The 53 bombers that never returned from Berlin became a symbol of this brutal arithmetic, a reminder that victory requires sacrifice and that those who order such sacrifices carry scars invisible to outsiders. Travis bore those scars with quiet dignity, neither seeking sympathy nor deflecting responsibility, simply acknowledging that this was the price of leadership in war. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.